Peacekeeping by the United Nations is a role of the UN's Department of Peace Operations as an instrument developed by the organization as a way to help countries torn by conflict to create the conditions for lasting peace. It is distinguished from peacebuilding, peacemaking, and peace enforcement, although the United Nations does acknowledge that all activities are mutually reinforcing and that overlap between them is frequent in practice. Peacekeepers monitor and observe peace processes in post-conflict areas and assist ex-combatants in implementing the peace agreements they may have signed. Such assistance comes in many forms, including separating former combatants, confidence-building measures, power-sharing arrangements, electoral assistance, strengthening the rule of law, and economic and social development. Accordingly, UN peacekeepers, often referred to as blue berets or blue helmets because of their light blue berets or helmets, can include soldiers, police officers, and civilian personnel. Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter gives the United Nations Security Council the power and responsibility to take collective action to maintain international peace and security. Most of these operations are established and implemented by the United Nations itself, with troops obeying UN operational control. In these cases, peacekeepers remain members of their respective armed forces, and do not constitute an independent UN army, as the UN does not have such a force. In cases where direct UN involvement is not considered appropriate or feasible, the Council authorizes regional organizations such as NATO, the Economic Community of West African States, or coalitions of willing countries to perform peacekeeping or peace enforcement tasks. Jean-Pierre Lacroix is the head of the Department of Peace Operations. He took over from the former Under-Secretary General Hervé Ladsis on April 1, 2017. Since 1997, all directors have been French. DPKO's highest-level doctrine document, entitled United Nations Peacekeeping Operations, Principles and Guidelines, was issued in 2008. Once a peace treaty has been negotiated, the parties involved might ask the United Nations for a peacekeeping force to supervise various elements of the agreed-upon plan. This is often done because a group controlled by the United Nations is less likely to favor the interests of any one party, since it itself is controlled by many groups, namely the 15-member Security Council and the intentionally diverse United Nations Secretariat. If the Security Council approves the creation of a mission, then the Department of Peacekeeping Operations begins planning for the necessary elements. At this time, the senior command team is selected. The department will then seek contributions from member nations. Since the UN has no standing force or supplies, it must form ad hoc coalitions for every task undertaken. Doing so results in both the possibility of failure to form a suitable force, and a general slowdown in procurement once the operation is in the field. Romeo Dallaire, force commander in Rwanda during the Rwandan genocide there, described the problems this poses by comparison to more traditional military deployments. He told me the UN was a pull system, not a push system like I had been used to with NATO, because the UN had absolutely no pool of resources to draw on. You had to make a request for everything you needed, and then you had to wait while that request was analyzed. For instance, soldiers everywhere have to eat and drink. In a push system, food and water for the number of soldiers deployed is automatically supplied. In a pull system, you have to ask for those rations, and no common sense seems to ever apply. Shake hands with the devil, Dallaire, pages 99 to 100. It has been shown that contributors deploy their troops with varying speed. While the peacekeeping force is being assembled, a variety of diplomatic activities are being undertaken by UN staff. The exact size and strength of the force must be agreed to by the government of the nation whose territory the conflict is on. The rules of engagement must be developed and approved by both the parties involved and the Security Council. These give the specific mandate and scope of the mission, e.g. when may the peacekeepers, if armed, use force, and where may they go within the host nation. Often, it will be mandated that peacekeepers have host government minders with them whenever they leave their base. This complexity has caused problems in the field. When all agreements have been completed, the required personnel are assembled, and final approval has been given by the Security Council, the peacekeepers are deployed to the region in question. The financial resources of UN peacekeeping operations are the collective responsibility of UN member states. Decisions about the establishment, maintenance, or expansion of peacekeeping operations are taken by the Security Council. According to UN Charter, every member state is obligated legally to pay their respective share for peacekeeping. Peacekeeping expenses are divided by the General Assembly based upon a formula established by member states which takes into account the relative economic wealth of member states among other factors. In 2017, the UN agreed to reduce the peacekeeping budget by $600 million after the US initially proposed a larger decrease of approximately $900 million. A United Nations peacekeeping mission has three power centers. The first is the Special Representative of the Secretary General, the official leader of the mission. This person is responsible for all political and diplomatic activity, overseeing relations with both the parties to the peace treaty and the UN member states in general. They are often a senior member of the Secretariat. The second is the Force Commander, who is responsible for the military forces deployed. They are a senior officer of their nation's armed services, and are often from the nation committing the highest number of troops to the project. Finally, the Chief Administrative Officer oversees supplies and logistics, and coordinates the procurement of any supplies needed. Citation needed. A Pakistani UNOSOM armed convoy making the rounds in Mogadishu. United Nations peacekeeping was initially developed during the Cold War as a means of resolving conflicts between states by deploying unarmed or lightly armed military personnel from a number of countries, commanded by the UN, to areas where warring parties were in need of a neutral party to observe the peace process. Peacekeepers could be activated when the major international powers, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, tasked the UN with helping to end conflicts threatening regional stability and international peace and security. These included a number of so-called proxy wars waged by client states of the superpowers. As of December 2019, there have been 72 UN peacekeeping operations since 1948, with 17 operations ongoing. Suggestions for new missions are made every year. The first peacekeeping mission was initiated in 1948. This mission, the United Nations Truce Supervision Organization, UNSO, was sent to the newly created State of Israel, where a conflict between the Israelis and the Arab states concerning the creation of Israel had just reached a ceasefire. The UNSO remains in operation to this day, although the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has certainly not abated. Almost a year later, the United Nations Military Observer Group in India and Pakistan, UNMOGIP, was authorized to monitor relations between the two nations, which were divided from each other after the United Kingdom's decolonization of the Indian subcontinent. As the Korean War ended with the Korean Armistice Agreement in 1953, UN forces remained along the south side of demilitarized zone until 1967, when American and South Korean forces took over. Returning its attention to the conflict between Israel and its Arab neighbors, the United Nations responded to Suez Crisis of 1956, a war between the alliance of the United Kingdom, France, and Israel, versus Egypt, which was supported by other Arab nations. When a ceasefire was declared in 1957, Canadian Secretary of State for External Affairs, and future Prime Minister, Lester Bowles Pearson suggested that the United Nations station a peacekeeping force in the Suez in order to ensure that the ceasefire was honored by both sides. Pearson had initially suggested that the force consist of mainly Canadian peacekeepers, but the Egyptians were suspicious of having a Commonwealth nation defend them against the United Kingdom and its allies. In the end, a wide variety of national forces were drawn upon to ensure national diversity. Pearson would win the Nobel Peace Prize for this work. Citation needed. In 1988, the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to the United Nations peacekeeping forces. The press release stated that the forces represent the manifest will of the community of nations and have made a decisive contribution to the resolution of conflict around the world. The end of the Cold War precipitated a dramatic shift in UN and multilateral peacekeeping. In a new spirit of cooperation, the Security Council established larger and more complex UN peacekeeping missions, often to help implement comprehensive peace agreements between belligerents in intrastate conflicts and civil wars. Furthermore, peacekeeping came to involve more and more non-military elements that ensured the proper functioning of civic functions, such as elections. The UN Department of Peacekeeping Operations was created in 1992 to assist this increased demand for such missions. By and large, the new operations were successful. In El Salvador and Mozambique, for example, peacekeeping provided ways to achieve self-sustaining peace. Some efforts failed, perhaps as the result of an overly optimistic assessment of what UN peacekeeping could accomplish. While complex missions in Cambodia and Mozambique were ongoing, the Security Council dispatched peacekeepers to conflict zones like Somalia, where neither ceasefires nor the consent of all the parties in conflict had been secured. These operations did not have the manpower, nor were they supported by the required political will, to implement their mandates. The failures, most notably the 1994 Rwandan genocide and the 1995 massacre in Srebrenica and Bosnia and Herzegovina, resulted in a period of retrenchment and self-examination in UN peacekeeping. As a result, the relatively small United Nations Transitional Administration for Eastern Slavonia, Varangia, and Western Sirmium, UNTAS, Transitional Administration in Eastern Slavonia, received a high degree of commitment and became a proving ground for ideas, methods, and procedures. It turned out to be considered the most successful UN mission, and was followed by other more ambitious transitional administrations in Kosovo, United Nations Interim Administration Mission in Kosovo, or UNMIK, and East Timor, United Nations Transitional Administration in East Timor, or UNTID. That period resulted, in part, in the United Nations Peacebuilding Commission, which works to implement stable peace through some of the same civic functions that peacekeepers also work on, such as elections. The Commission currently works with 6 countries, all in Africa. The UN peacekeeping's commitment to protecting cultural heritage dates back to 2012, when there was extensive destruction in Mali. In this matter, the protection of a country's cultural heritage was included in the mandate of a United Nations mission, Resolution 2100, for the first time in history. In addition to many other advances, Italy signed an agreement with UNESCO in February 2016 to create the world's first emergency task force for culture, composed of civilian experts and the Italian Carabinieri. The UN Peace Mission UNIFIL, together with Blue Shield International, in 2019 sought to protect the UNESCO World Heritage in Lebanon. 3 female UN peacekeepers celebrate International Day of the UN Peacekeeper 2023, on 25 May, in Goma, North Kivu, DRC. Women have regularly participated in global peacekeeping efforts, including through the United Nations. Although participation greatly increased in the last decade of the 20th century and the first 2 decades of the 21st century, women remain significantly underrepresented in peacekeeping operations in 2023. The participation of women in peacekeeping operations differs significantly between military contingents, military observers, staff officers versus police units. Gender stereotypes and discrimination often limit women's opportunities for advancement and leadership roles within international organizations and military institutions. Additionally, women often face discrimination and harassment in male-dominated peacekeeping environment. The inclusion of women in peacekeeping operations provides access to places and people inaccessible to men and improves communication quality with civilian communities. Studies have shown that peacekeeping missions with a higher percentage of female personnel are more effective in reducing violence and achieving long-lasting peace agreements. Women peacekeepers have been instrumental in addressing issues such as sexual violence, human trafficking, and gender-based discrimination, which are prevalent in conflict-affected areas. Women peacekeepers also serve as role models for women and girls in these areas, showing them that women can be powerful and influential agents of change. In October 2000, United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325, S/Res/1325, on women, peace and security was adopted unanimously by the UN Security Council, after recalling resolutions 1261, 1999, 1265, 1999, 1296, 2000, and 1314, 2000. The resolution acknowledged the disproportionate and unique impact of armed conflict on women and girls. It calls for the adoption of a gender perspective to consider the special needs of women and girls during conflict, repatriation and resettlement, rehabilitation, reintegration, and post-conflict reconstruction. The UN Charter stipulates that to assist in maintaining peace and security around the world, all member states of the UN should make available to the Security Council necessary armed forces and facilities. Since 1948, almost 130 nations have contributed military and civilian police personnel to peace operations. While detailed records of all personnel who have served in peacekeeping missions since 1948 are not available, it is estimated that as many as 1 million soldiers, police officers, and civilians have served as UN peacekeepers during the last 56 years. As of June 2022, 120 countries were contributing a total of 74,892 personnel in peacekeeping operations, with Bangladesh leading the tally, 6,700, followed by India, 5,832, Nepal, 5,794, Rwanda, 5,283, and Pakistan, 4,399. In addition to military and police personnel, 5,187 international civilian personnel, 2,031 UN volunteers and 12,036 local civilian personnel worked in UN peacekeeping missions as of March 2008. Through October 2018, 3,767 people from more than 100 countries had been killed while serving on peacekeeping missions. Many of those came from India, 163, Nigeria, 153, Pakistan, 150, Bangladesh, 146, and Ghana, 138. 30% of the fatalities during the first 55 years of UN peacekeeping occurred in the years 1993 to 1995. The rate of reimbursement by the UN for troop contributing countries per peacekeeper per month include $1,028 for pay and allowances, $303 supplementary pay for specialists, $68 for personal clothing, gear, and equipment, and $5 for personal weaponry. Canada has served in over 50 peacekeeping missions, including every United Nations, UN, peacekeeping effort from its inception until 1989. Canada provided the most amount of UN peacekeepers during the Cold War with approximately 80,000 personnel, equivalent to 10% of total Union forces. In all, more than 125,000 Canadian men and women military personnel, civilians, diplomats, including over 4,000 Canadian police officers, have served in peacekeeping operations. Approximately 130 Canadians have died in service of peacekeeping operations, with 123 of these deaths occurring during UN missions. 7 Canadians have been UN force commanders and 2 Canadians have been commanders of UN observer missions. In the United States, the Bill Clinton and George W. Bush administrations began with differing philosophies but came to adopt remarkably similar policies using peace operations to assist American foreign policy. Initial ideological concerns were replaced by pragmatic decisions about how to assist UN peace operations. Both administrations were reluctant to contribute large contingents of ground troops to uncommanded operations, even as both administrations endorsed increases in the number and scale of UN missions. According to scholar Paige Fortna, there is strong evidence that the presence of peacekeepers significantly reduces the risk of renewed warfare. More peacekeeping troops results in fewer battlefield and civilian deaths. There is also evidence that the promise to deploy peacekeepers can help international organizations in bringing combatants to negotiate and increase the likelihood that they will agree to a ceasefire. However, there have been several reports during UN peacekeeping missions of human rights abuse by UN soldiers, notably in the Central African Republic in 2015. The cost of these missions is also significant, with the United Nations mission in South Sudan, UNMISS, costing $1 billion per year for 12,500 UN soldiers unable to prevent the country's civil war. Often missions require approval from local governments before deploying troops, which can also limit the effectiveness of UN missions. Nicholas Sambanese asserts that the presence of a UN peacekeeping mission is correlated with a positive effect on the achievement of peace, especially in the short term. However, he notes that this effect is lessened over time. Thus, the longer that peacekeepers remain in a country, the greater the likelihood that peace will maintain. Acknowledging the success that UN peacekeeping operations have achieved in increasing political participation, Sambanese claims that a greater emphasis on economic development would further increase the efficacy of peacekeeping efforts. Another study suggests that doubling the peacekeeping operation budget, stronger peacekeeping operation mandates, and a doubling of the PKO budget would reduce armed conflicts by as much as 2/3 relative to a scenario without PKOs. An analysis of 47 peace operations by Virginia Page Fortna of Columbia University found that the involvement of UN personnel generally resulted in enduring peace. Political scientists Han Fjelde, Lisa Hultman, and Desiree Nilsson of Uppsala University studied 20 years of data on peacekeeping missions, including in Lebanon, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and the Central African Republic, and concluded that they were more effective at reducing civilian casualties than counterterrorism operations by nation-states. A 2021 study in the American Political Science Review found that the presence of UN peacekeeping missions had a weak correlation with rule of law while conflict is ongoing, but a robust correlation during periods of peace. The study also found that the relationship is stronger for civilian than uniformed personnel, and is strongest when UN missions engage host states in the process of reform. Likewise, Georgetown University professor Lisa Howard argues that UN peacekeeping operations are more effective by virtue of their lack of compelling force, rather, their use of nonviolent methods such as verbal persuasion, financial inducements, and coercion short of offensive military force, including surveillance and arrest, are likelier to pacify warring parties. A 2021 study in the American Journal of Political Science found that UN peacekeeping in South Sudan had a positive effect on the local economy. According to a 2011 study, UN peacekeeping missions were most likely to be successful if they had assistance and consent from domestic actors in the host state. Reporters witnessed a rapid increase of prostitution in Cambodia and Mozambique after UN peacekeeping forces moved in. In the 1996 UN study The Impact of Armed Conflict on Children, the former First Lady of Mozambique Graca Machel documented, in 6 out of 12 country studies on sexual exploitation of children in situations of armed conflict prepared for the present report, the arrival of peacekeeping troops has been associated with a rapid rise in child prostitution. Gita Sahgal spoke out in 2004 about the fact that prostitution and sex abuse occurs wherever humanitarian intervention efforts are established. She observed, "The issue with the UN is that peacekeeping operations, unfortunately, seems to be doing the same thing that other militaries do. Even the guardians have to be guarded." The following table chart illustrates confirmed accounts of crimes and human rights violations committed by United Nations soldiers, peacekeepers, and employees. In response to criticism, particularly of the cases of sexual abuse by peacekeepers, the UN has taken steps toward reforming its operations. The Brahimi report was the first of many steps to recap former peacekeeping missions, isolate flaws, and take steps to patch these mistakes to ensure the efficiency of future peacekeeping missions. The UN has vowed to continue to put these practices into effect when performing peacekeeping operations in the future. The technocratic aspects of the reform process have been continued and revitalized by the DPKO in its Peace Operations 2010 reform agenda. This included an increase in personnel, the harmonization of the conditions of service of field and headquarters staff, the development of guidelines and standard operating procedures, and improving the partnership arrangement between the Department of Peacekeeping Operations, DPKO, and the United Nations Development Programme, UNDP, African Union, and European Union. 2008 capstone doctrine entitled United Nations Peacekeeping Operations, Principles and Guidelines incorporates and builds on the Brahimi analysis. One suggestion to account for delays such as the one in Rwanda is a rapid reaction force, a peacekeeping force similar to a standing army capable of quickly deploying to crises such as genocides, administered by the UN and deployed by the Security Council. The UN Rapid Reaction Force would consist of military personnel from Security Council members or UN member states who would be stationed in their home countries, but would have the same training, equipment, and procedures, and would conduct joint exercises with other forces. The UN peacekeeping capacity was enhanced in 2007 by augmenting the DPKO with the new Department of Field Support, DFS. Whereas the new entity serves as a key enabler by coordinating the administration and logistics in UN peacekeeping operations, DPKO concentrates on policy planning and providing strategic directions. Women have regularly participated in global peacekeeping efforts, including through the United Nations. Although participation greatly increased in the last decade of the 20th century and the first 2 decades of the 21st century, women remain significantly underrepresented in peacekeeping operations in 2023. The participation of women in peacekeeping operations differs significantly between military contingents, military observers, staff officers versus police units. Gender stereotypes and discrimination often limit women's opportunities for advancement and leadership roles within international organizations and military institutions. Additionally, women often face discrimination and harassment in male-dominated peacekeeping environment. The inclusion of women in peacekeeping operations provides access to places and people inaccessible to men and improves communication quality with civilian communities. Studies have shown that peacekeeping missions with a higher percentage of female personnel are more effective in reducing violence and achieving long-lasting peace agreements. Women peacekeepers have been instrumental in addressing issues such as sexual violence, human trafficking, and gender-based discrimination, which are prevalent in conflict-affected areas. Women peacekeepers also serve as role models for women and girls in these areas, showing them that women can be powerful and influential agents of change. In October 2000, United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325, S/Res/1325, on women, peace, and security was adopted unanimously by the UN Security Council, after recalling resolutions 1261, 1999, 1265, 1999, 1296, 2000, and 1314, 2000. The resolution acknowledged the disproportionate and unique impact of armed conflict on women and girls. It calls for the adoption of a gender perspective to consider the special needs of women and girls during conflict, repatriation and resettlement, rehabilitation, reintegration, and post-conflict reconstruction. A rise in women's participation in peacekeeping significantly contributes to an increase in safety and security. Effects include wider dissemination to civilians by acting as a safe environment to report abuses such as sexual violence. There are circumstances in which certain settings are not disclosed to men, and women peacekeepers aid in acquiring intelligence regarding such events within the local population. These circumstances coincide with women peacekeepers examining women competence during disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration procedures. Dispute resolutions are enriched due to women peacekeepers' decreased reliance on undue force compared to male peacekeepers. One gender parity within peacekeeping acts as diversification within missions, giving rise to participation empowerment and a rise in a mission capacity. For instance, the percentage of women in Liberian National Security Forces increased from 6% to 17% over a period of 9 years. This was attributed to all female police units having been present in the United Nations mission in Liberia. 1. The backlash factor leads to increased visibility. Women in peacekeeping subvert the cultural expectations of women within states where peacekeeping occurs. Women become inspired by these roles that women peacekeepers take on as they go against the societal norm and illustrate that such actions are possible. According to Neville Melvin Gertze of Namibia, speaking at an October 2019 meeting of the United Nations Security Council, peace agreements that are the result of negotiations including women are 35% more likely to last at least 15 years than those which are the result of men-only negotiations. At the same meeting, United Nations Secretary-General Antonio Guterres stated that women were excluded from peace processes, attacks against women human rights defenders had increased, and only a tiny percentage of funding for peace building was given to women's organizations. As of October 2022, women constituted about 6% of military personnel. In January 2021, women constituted 11% of police units and 28% of individual police in peacekeeping missions. These numbers underrepresent women, but are greater than the 1% women's component of overall uniformed peacekeeping personnel in 1993. The 2028 target is for women to constitute 15% of military contingents, 20% of police units, and 30% of individual police officers. United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325, UNSCR 1325, establishes 4 pillars: participation, protection, prevention, relief, and recovery. Participation aims to increase women's involvement in UN peacekeeping operations. Protection seeks to better safeguard civilians from sexual exploitation and gender-based violence. Prevention entails enhancing protocols for mediating violence against women in conjunction with assisting local women's peace measures, reinforcing women's rights, and ensuring repercussions for those who infringe on international law. Relief and recovery commit assistance through a gendered perspective in times of crisis. The United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325 calls for states to initiate specific protocols to safeguard women and girls from gender-based crimes, specifically rape and sexual abuse. In 1975, the Decade for Women was established, which marked the beginning of the Women, Peace, and Security Strategy. There was a renewed call for action after the genocides in Rwanda and Bosnia. Resolution 1325 supports implementation of the Women, Peace, and Security Strategy, which addresses the role of gender and the term gender mainstreaming, the incorporation of an outlook on gender regarding topics such as security. Women's participation in peacekeeping is considered vital to implementing safety and security through a series of mission improvements. There is greater diversity, first-hand accounts, and precedent for more women peacekeepers. With more women participating in missions, there are more opportunities for reform because of experiencing the indirect effects of issues such as war. Outside the UN, women have also been involved in peacebuilding as well as peacekeeping. Women set up different organizations in local areas, calling on society to stop violence and maintain peace. For example, women have been fighting in the front line of peacekeeping, shuttling between the two sides of the conflict, actively coordinating and organizing peace negotiations, and promoting the peaceful development of the country. Women also provide some psychological counseling and living assistance to refugees and victims. Through these actions, women let the media and the world know that their efforts are proving the importance of peace. It is not easy for women to participate in peacekeeping outside the UN, but there are still some factors that motivate them to take part in the work. From the perspective of individual women, the danger to life, gender-based violence, and disruption of education all drive women to stop the war. Also, the leaders of the government and the armed forces are not promoting peace, which makes women come forward and participate in peacekeeping work. From a community perspective, women are more likely than men to reject hierarchy within their group, further promoting women to build peace across differences. From the perspective of the warring parties, women as intermediaries are perceived as honest and less threatening, which leads to women's access to warring parties' leaders and facilitates negotiations. Examples of women's peacekeeping work outside the UN. Visakha Dharmadasa, the founder of Parents of Servicemen Missing in Action and the Association of War-Affected Women. Women of Liberia Mass Action for Peace. Paiman Alumni Trust. Voice of Libyan Women. Realizing Inclusion in Practice, the Philippines. Women in peacekeeping face significant challenges, such as unsafe working environments, unequal access to opportunities, lack of information regarding missions, and lack of resources. Women peacekeepers are often deployed without sufficient information and training. This leads to peacekeepers dealing with dangers when they happen rather than being knowledgeable on what steps to take prior to such circumstances. At the same time, compared with their peers, women participating in peacekeeping generally lack the special training for the roles they are required to play and have fewer opportunities for promotion. More broadly, lack of data is also a challenge, as many contributing countries do not provide information on the number of women in the ranks. Secondly, the goals set for female participants are difficult to fully achieve. Of the countries currently sending women peacekeepers, only 5 have met their goals. The UN has not given more resources to achieve a higher female participation rate. Part of the challenge is what role women should play when they participate in peacekeeping, rather than simply being tools for equality between men and women. It is also likely that some sending countries prefer to have short-term women members to avoid punishment or gain rewards from UN, rather than actually getting more women involved in peacekeeping in the long term. Finally, women's status in peacekeeping will be labeled and their achievements will be weakened or erased. In many UN documents, women are labeled as vulnerable groups. Such a narrow definition would limit women to be treated only as victims in need of protection, rather than participating in their own protection or the struggle for peace, national liberation, and independence. Women's participation in peacekeeping outside the UN also faces problems and difficulties. First, women's peacekeeping is sometimes ineffective by the fact that operations are ad hoc and decentralized, limited to public marches or observation. Second, lack of funding prevents women from further peacekeeping operations. These restrictions include women's inability to attract more people to join, limited activity locations, and limited activity forms. The COVID-19 pandemic posed a significant challenge to UN peacekeepers. UN women peacekeepers are an important integral part of the peacekeeping process and face the challenge directly. Women peacekeepers have contributed to promoting scientific protection knowledge, providing local medical services, and distributing supplies. Furthermore, women peacekeepers not only actively participated in peace and political processes, but also promoted the integration of gender into response planning under the COVID-19 pandemic. However, despite the efforts of UN women peacekeepers to maintain peace and promote gender equality, the COVID-19 pandemic continues to have serious negative impacts on women through 4 aspects. In terms of economy, women who were already living on the economic margins had been hit harder by the COVID-19 pandemic, with their incomes reduced by layoffs and housework. In terms of health, women formed 70% of the health workforce, so they have been affected by the virus more severely. In addition, women's unique health needs have not been guaranteed. In terms of unpaid care work, the number of unpaid nursing and unpaid child care work undertaken by women in the community and families has increased significantly due to the pandemic, which has reduced women's equal opportunities to work and girls' right to continue their education. In terms of gender-based violence, the data reported shows a 25% increase in cases of gender-based violence against women. In 2020, the head of UN Women stated that further participation and leadership of female peacekeepers would be crucial to advancing peace processes and promoting gender equality in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you for watching this video.